Morning, everyone. First of all, I want to say thanks to Karen for sharing her very personal story. We really appreciate that. My name is Sean Marin. I'm a second-year law student here at UND, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce our next speaker this morning. Professor Robin Runge, as many of you know, is no stranger to the hallways here at UND. In addition to her past work as an associate professor at the Housing and Employment Law Clinic, she's also taught domestic violence and public interest law here and at educational institutions around the country. For more than 20 years, Professor Runge has worked on behalf of victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. Her work and scholarship have been instrumental in helping to shape policy responses to violence against women at the local, state, national, and international levels. She served as an advisor and board member for the likes of Legal Services of North Dakota, the Grand Forks Community Violence Intervention Center, and the North Dakota Council on Abused Women's Services. She's a former director on the Commission of Domestic Violence at the American Bar Association and founder of the Domestic Violence and Employment Project at the Legal Aid Society in San Francisco. As a well-known expert, she frequently consults with attorneys, judges, and non-governmental entities to help refine legal responses to violence against women. She's currently on leave from her faculty duties here at UND for a good reason. In 2012, she was awarded a one-year Fulbright scholarship to research violence against women in the Chinese legal system at the Institute of Law at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. Her presentation today will highlight recent developments in Chinese domestic violence law, present her research to date, and review the current and future legal challenges of responding to Chinese domestic violence. We really appreciate her making the long trek from China to be here with us today and share her expertise in this field. So please join me in giving a warm welcome back to Professor Robin Runge.
Good morning, or good evening, depending upon what time zone you're on. Thank you so much, Sean and Crystal and everybody at the Law Review for having me. And I just want to thank the law school for flying me back from Beijing for this. It's not inexpensive. You know, coach for 13 hours. Everyone should experience it once and only once. But I'm thrilled to be here. What I've noticed about myself when I do this trip is about 80% of the time I'm good. And then about 20% of the time, it's just frightening. So I'm just apologizing in advance if I, you know, I'm a little off because of the time zone difference. You know, I've been doing this work for a very long time. And I think the jet lag actually affects me in the sense that like my emotions are a little closer to the top than they usually are. And sitting this morning watching the video and then listening to you, you know, reminds me why I do this work. And is really, you know, it's hard because I think many of us who do this and have been affected by this, we move between hope, right? Because we see amazing strength, right? And frustration, and at the fact that we can't seem to stop this ongoing epidemic in our communities. And that's kind of the range of emotions that I felt when I was sitting there. You know, on the one hand, immense respect and hope for the women that I've had the privilege of serving and knowing, and the families, but also as someone who has committed my life to trying to get the legal system to be a more effective tool for survivors, I still remain frustrated. And what's so wonderful about my opportunity to travel and live in Beijing for this year is that I am learning more about other countries' efforts to address this issue through their legal systems. And I'm getting a little more hopeful again, which is kind of nice. And I think sometimes people might imagine that we may not have very much to learn from China in this regard. Sometimes I think China gets a bum rap over here in terms of human rights and a variety of other things. But I have already learned in my short period of time there that we have an enormous amount to learn from one another. Before I get to my slides, I want to just say that before I started doing work internationally on violence against women, I don't know that I completely understood that what it looked like and its impacts on communities would be so similar, whether you're in Egypt or in China or in Dubai or in France. And my work over the years has helped me see and learn that, in fact, the dynamics of the abuse, the power and control that we heard so vividly described, that includes physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse and sexual abuse, economic abuse, is actually frighteningly similar everywhere. And this has been recognized by the UN, this has been recognized by the World Health Organization. You know, in the last 20 years, we've exchanged increasing amounts of information globally, and I'm happy to say that we have much more information through those bodies and through meetings like the UN Beijing Women's Conference that took place there in '95, where people come together and say, well, this is what violence against women looks like in my community, right, in this country, and this is what it looks like in Florida, and this is what it looks like in Mexico, and this is what it looks like in Norway. And you sit around and you just kind of are shocked because as you read about it, it's the same dynamic. There's a power and control dynamic. There's a gender component to this. And so it is not, as a result, to me, as surprising to learn that the legal system responses that are evolving around the globe share some commonalities in terms of the strategies they're attempting to employ and the challenges that they're facing in trying to stop the abuse. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn to my slides and just share with you some of the research that I've started to do and some of the information that I'm gathering about what China has already done to address violence against women, and domestic violence in particular. So something that is particularly unique. So one unique distinction between the United States and many countries actually around the world that are attempting to create and have begun to create a legal system response is the systems of government, right? This is a distinction, but also whether or not they view themselves to be a part of the global solution through international human rights treaties. So as you know here, we just had an election recently. You know, we're a democracy. We vote. We vote in mass quantities occasionally, recently, kind of cool. And that is not insignificant in how our justice system chooses to address violence against women, right? The fact that judges are elected is a valuable part of that conversation, right? The fact that we have a participatory process whereby through filing of complaints, right, and other systems, passing of laws that we as individuals can come together and draft, that's how we can address this, right? China is in transition. It is a quasi-communist capitalist society. There certainly is no voting happening, though yesterday they're changing of the guard. So because they can't describe it as an election. What's happening right now is the leaders of the country are all meeting in Beijing. I'm really glad I'm not there. It's a lockdown situation, and are changing who's going to become the new prime minister and the president. There's like 12 people sitting in a room for 7 days. And that's happening right now, and that's a profound process. But there's not external forces involved in that, right? These are people who've come to those positions through connections and through accomplishments in positions they've held around the country. But there's no external population involved in that, right? Like your average Chinese person doesn't have a vote in what's happening inside those meetings over the next 8 days, okay? And that affects how laws are passed. Right? So there's no separation of power structures. There's one party, right? The judges and the lawmakers are all members of that party. There's some question as a result of independence of that judiciary in terms of how they enforce laws, how they choose laws. And there's a lot of question about how laws are drafted and the enforcement of those laws. And that's something I'm still learning a lot about, okay? In addition to that, something that's unique is that years ago, that's a really interesting error message. Years ago, in 1980, China actually signed the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is shortly known as CEDAW. And this is the International Human Rights Treaty that really focuses, among others, but is viewed as the one that is most focused on violence against women. And countries who are signatories to it then are basically agreeing to take steps to end violence against women in their countries. And China, again, signed that a long time ago, right? And that marked a very significant passage for the Chinese government to sign that. That was not a small undertaking. And this is actually discussed readily in the research that I'm seeing as kind of the starting place in many ways. Not that violence against women didn't exist previously in China, but this created a small opening for discussion. Then, in 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women was held in Beijing. This is the UN World Conference. And that truly was a watershed moment in developing not just of a legal system response, but like a national societal response to violence against women. Because it allowed China to participate in a world setting where everyone was acknowledging that this was a problem in their countries. And this is a huge issue culturally for China. China is very sensitive to being like picked on, right? And being like, you're worse than everyone else. You know, you have a problem that nobody else has. So creating a situation, right, in where all the leaders from all these different countries are coming together, right, and saying, we have a problem, violence against women is a problem, we're trying to create systems to address it, created an opening for members of the community who were concerned to say, yes, we want to do something about this. We've adopted CEDAW, we're a party to that treaty, and we want to undertake national efforts to address this. And I want to say that the opening I'm describing is one in which they could have those conversations publicly and not be afraid of being arrested or detained, is actually the language. Nobody gets arrested, you get detained, okay? And so that's really significant. In contrast, the United States is one of a very few countries at this point that is not a signatory, has not ratified, our Congress has not ratified CEDAW, okay? So how this trickles down in terms of how Chinese laws, and we're going to see that in a little bit, and advocates, the party, judges, the average person talks about domestic violence in China is that it's viewed as a violence against women human rights issue. It's a violation of human rights to commit violence against women in China. Anybody hear that talked about that way here? Right. Interesting question about whether or not that's significant in terms of effectually changing cultural and societal values and getting laws passed that will effectively help end violence against women, okay? So now what I'm going to focus on is a brief history of legal system responses. And what's going to be interesting, at least it's interesting for me, again, I'm spending all my time doing this right now, so please forgive me. I've become that little nerd, right, who sits at a desk all day and is like, oh my God, that's so cool. So, okay, forgive me if I'm overly excited about random decisions that I found in China, but this is fascinating. So the very first policy or law that was drafted in China addressing, that actually mentions domestic violence or violence against women was in 1996, okay, on a local level, not on a national level, on a local level. So that is interesting because remember, right, the UN Fourth World Conference on Women was in 1995 in Beijing, right? So notice what's happening. The very next year in Changsha, in Hunan province, I do not speak Chinese, I do not, adopted this decision, and this is what it's titled, this is the English translation, Decision on How to Prevent and Stop Domestic Violence. And this is the first policy paper that was ever drafted and adopted addressing domestic violence. And it's important, it was issued by the Chinese government at this sub-national level. So I need to say, because it's a communist government, everything is very structured, if that makes any sense. Like the top down, it's like a pyramid scheme, for lack of a better description. So nothing happens at the local level that the party at the top is not aware of, right? So this was something that the leaders on a community level decided to adopt, which means it was approved at the national level. So this was amazing. And again, it's interesting to look at it because it's not a law, it's a policy paper. So an interesting question for me as I look at that is what power does a policy paper have, right, from a legal standpoint, right? If that defines domestic violence or says the police have to arrest, right, someone who commits that, right, do they have to, right? Is it like a law or is it just an advisory? Interesting question. Now, the other thing I just want to note is in 1994 is when we passed the Violence Against Women Act here in the United States, which is our federal law that prohibits violence against women and has funded a lot of programs here in North Dakota, and by the way, is up for reauthorization. Please call your member of Congress. So interesting timing, right? Think about that. I think there is a lot of misunderstanding, perhaps, that the United States is so far ahead, right, of China in these areas, and so far ahead of many other countries. Not necessarily, right? And it's interesting to think about what was happening here at the same time that these developments were taking place in China, okay? Then the next documented example of some policy that was adopted in China was in 2000, where the People's Congress Standing Committee of Hunan province. Hunan tends to be very, I'm learning, very kind of forward. And has really good food, so I'm going to go there soon, passed a resolution on how to prevent and stop domestic violence. And this was the first anti-domestic violence regulation to be enacted, thanks for figuring that out, by local administration in China. So notice, this is a resolution, right, versus the previous document is a policy. Again, I don't know actually yet what the distinction is. Okay? So, the first national level acknowledgement of domestic violence in the law in China was much later in 2001. And this is actually interesting because I'm going to compare it to the US legal system's starting place. So in April of 2001, amendments were adopted to China's national marriage law. Notice it's not called family law, I'm just going to point that out. It's called marriage law, okay? And the amendments recognize domestic violence as one of the 3 permissible reasons for divorce. So if any of you have taken family law or been in the family law courts, you may know that in the US, our family law system is one where most states have a no-fault divorce system. Anybody know what that means? Anybody want to guess? Okay, Brad, the practitioner in the room can always answer the question. Why don't we, anybody want to guess when I say what no-fault divorce means? Yes. You don't have a reason. I woke up this morning, I'm not into it anymore. The Britney Spears example comes to mind, right? Okay, so you can get divorced for no reason. In China, this is actually not the case at all. Getting divorced is a huge deal, and it is shunned socially and culturally even today. And so they have the inverse, which is very limited permissible reasons under which you can seek a divorce, okay? And as of 2001, one of the 3 reasons acknowledged, so think about how considerable this is huge, right? That a woman, and the other thing is it's important, that a man or a woman can come forward, right? And say, I don't want to be married to him anymore because of domestic violence. So that was a huge, huge change. It also held perpetrators legally accountable for domestic violence, okay? So I'm starting to look at that language and understand in the context of marital law how that comes about. And what I'm learning is that the division we have in our court system and our legal system between criminal and civil laws is not quite the same in China. They kind of merge all over the place. And this is one of the places where they merge. So what I've started to research in this area is how, under the marital law, under these provisions, a perpetrator can be held legally accountable. And the number one way is that if it is proven, his legal accountability is he will lose his marriage, which is losing face. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Okay, but beyond that, I think some courts and some judges have also taken some criminal actions in the context of these marital divorce cases, which I think is interesting. It also provided legal remedies for victims. Again, divorce being a legal remedy. We don't actually think of it that way necessarily here, but in China, that's a legal remedy. You come in, you're married to someone who's abusing you, you prove that that abuse is occurring, and your remedy is freedom from that abuse, right? Which means dissolution of the marriage, which is significant in China, okay? And then provided a legal definition of domestic violence. So this is the first time, right, that we see on a national level in China
the terms domestic violence and violence against women. And it's in the marital law, the federal marital law. So again, comparing it to the United States, just having a little constitutional law moment, right? Family law is mostly state law driven, right? There isn't really an equivalent, you know, of like a federal family law, right? There's some regulation on a federal level of family law, but not a lot because of the way our Constitution has been drafted. In China, there are not those issues, okay? So we have a federal marital law. Now, the other thing I just want to mention is on a state level, the first legal interventions that we saw, laws passed in the US addressing violence against women, were criminal in the 1970s, making it a crime, right, to commit domestic violence. There's no criminal law today on a federal level making domestic violence a crime. Instead, they started in the marital law. Interesting. Okay. In December of that same year, China's Supreme People's Court, which is the equivalent of our Supreme Court, issued interpretation for issues regarding the marriage law of the People's Republic of China. So this is the equivalent of regulations, right? They issued regulations interpreting that, and it provided the first national level guidance on how judges, should handle cases involving domestic violence. So this is the very first time that any guidance or discussion was had on a national level about how the judiciary, and it's not a branch of government in China, it's a part of the whole, should be handling these issues. Okay? Then the next place that we see legal system response is in August of 2005, right, where China's law on the protection of women's rights and interests. By the way, I love that they have a law on the protection of women's rights and interests. I'm just going to pause there for a moment, right? What's that law in the United States? The one on the protection of the interests of women, and, right? Interesting. I can't wait to get into that. Why is that? Why don't we? What's the impetus for this? Why does China have this law? How long have they had it? Because these are just amendments to it. I don't have answers to that yet, okay? So they amended it in 2005, and it included stipulations prohibiting domestic violence against women. Okay, so this is an affirmative statement in another legal setting outside of marital law. Requirements that the government should take action to prevent and stop domestic violence. Now that's very strident in a communist government situation, right? Like now it's saying that the government is accountable. And I should tell you that this is parallel to what CEDAW requires, right? That International Human Rights Treaty I'd mentioned. It mandates that the government has to take action, to address domestic violence and violence against women, okay? It requires intervention in domestic violence situations, and it requires that assistance be provided to women who are victims, and clarified that violations of this law are subject to administrative penalties by the police, I don't know what that means yet, and prosecution by the People's Civil Court. So that's where that quasi-civil criminal thing comes into play, okay? So after the amendments to the marital law, this was a significant step forward. So what's interesting for me in the conversations I'm starting to have with advocates in China is understanding what the significance of this is from a rule of law perspective, right? How does this trickle down to specific rights for women? And I don't have answers yet, okay? And then in 2006, the Chinese law on the protection of minors was amended to include specific provisions to prevent minors from domestic violence. So this is interesting, right? Is that in the same time frame that they're addressing violence against women, they're acknowledging that children are also victims. And so far, what I've been able to get my hands on in terms of the amendments frames it very clearly as acknowledging not just that children may be targets in domestic violence situations, but being present in a home where domestic violence is occurring makes them victims. And that's a very forward perspective on that, which we didn't come to in our legal history until much later in many ways. Okay? So by September 2008, what we start to see between the first policy papers and resolutions being adopted in Hunan and other sub-national levels in the early 2000s to 2008, we see that 20 provinces, municipalities, and autonomous regions, I'm not going to get into what that is, it's weird, in China had put into place some legal mechanisms to prevent domestic violence. So these are like the equivalent of states, the District of Columbia, Guam, actually, territories, right? And as of October of that year, 23 provinces, municipalities, autonomous regions had adopted enforcement plans for that law on protection for women, including domestic violence. So now what we're seeing is how does that national law and the amendments to that national law get trickled down, right, and result in changes in how money is spent, right, and allocated, right, what training is being done, how are these things being enforced? So for example, this is the equivalent of the Violence Against Women Act getting passed, and then a few years later, North Dakota getting some support from the communist government and doing trainings of police on domestic violence. So then in 2008, this document, which is really interesting because again, from my perspective of a lawyer trained in the United States, I'm like, this has no power, who cares, it's not a law. But this has actually been very significant. So the All China Women's Federation, which is a communist government funded quasi-non-government agency with offices in every single province in China that provides a range of services to women and is very highly regarded, right? The publicity department of the Central Committee, so that would be like the press office for the Senate, okay, of the United States. The Supreme People's Protectorate Ministry of Public Security, the police. The Ministry of Civil Affairs, and I actually don't know, I think that might be like the Civil Division of the Department of Justice. The Ministry of Justice, I'm not clear yet who they are. And the Ministry of Health, which would be like DHHS, published this paper, which contained an enormous amount of research. And it's called Some Opinions Regarding the Issue of How to Prevent and Inhibit Domestic Violence. So this is interesting. I want to just flag for you for a minute. Look at the document descriptions here, right? The first one is legal mechanisms to prevent domestic violence. The second document is described as enforcement plans for prevention. And then this is also about prevention and inhibiting. Not reacting, does that make sense? Not punishing, right? This is not stuff about reactive, it's about prevention. And in the US, our evolution, our legal system response evolution, really didn't get to prevention until about 4 or 5 years ago, where we started really to change how we were looking at this and started focusing on teens, started understanding this was a learned behavior, started looking about the fact that children raised in violent homes experience long life consequences, started looking at our legal system and saying, is there something we can do from a legal perspective to kind of, instead of always reacting, right, figuring out how to punish the person who committed this, how do we change how we think about this? That's very recent here, okay? And given the short period of time in which China has been developing their legal system response, they're on like overdrive, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm really interested to learn more about that development, okay? So then, in March of 2003, the Anti-Domestic Violence Network, which is the equivalent of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So this is an umbrella organization in China that has membership of, there's about 12 battered women's shelters in China that I'm aware of. There are a smattering of counseling centers, not a lot of non-governmental agencies and organizations in China. But this is the umbrella organization in China, based in Beijing, and it does a lot of policy work, and it's looked toward as the expert in these issues, readily quoted in the news, readily quoted in the paper, and they drafted the first draft proposal of the Law of the People's Republic on China on prevention and punishment of domestic violence. So this is their equivalent of the Violence Against Women Act. So this was put forward to the Congress, the People's Congress, in 2003. And in 2006, they received funding, and most of the funding that the Anti-Domestic Violence Network receives is actually from outside of the country of China, and not from the government. And so they got some funding, and in 2006, did a nationwide resource campaign to really educate and go out and find out what are the issues in all the different provinces. What do you think should be in this national law? And held a series of symposiums and asked survivors, advocates, police, judges, lawyers, every stakeholder you can imagine for their feedback about what should go in this national law. Okay? And that resulted in a revised draft that was issued in, I think, 2008. Okay? Now, again, it's not like here, when I worked in Washington, D.C., we worked closely with members of Congress and the Senate and the House, and we would go through many, many drafts of the Violence Against Women Act, and we knew who we were talking to, and we understood the process, and it was very transparent, right? We saw how bills would be discussed. It's all on C-SPAN if you're so inclined, right? In China, It's a big black box. So as I understand it, this non-governmental organization tries to maintain relationships with people who they believe are sympathetic to or committed to or interested in these issues, so that hopefully they will consider putting forward this draft proposal for consideration at some point in the future. But they never know, which is actually somewhat similar. I mean, it took 14 years to pass the Violence Against Women Act, so just a frame of reference in the United States. So what has happened, though, is that about every 4 or 5 years, the National People's Congress, which is the kind of the combination of the Senate and the House of Representatives, issues this strategic plan, 5-year strategic plan. And in 2011, the one that they issued actually specifically included legislation on anti-domestic violence as a legislative preparatory project, which was like a watershed moment in China for the anti-domestic violence movement, that they actually even mentioned this legislation as a part of their priorities in the next 5 years. All right, but again, they have no idea. I just met with them last week. They have no idea when or if this is going to bubble up. So they are now working on the next draft, since the last one was completed in 2008. They are now going out and doing those symposia again, going around the country, gathering information. They have more changes that they want to make to the draft law while they're waiting for the National People's Congress to decide whether or not they're going to consider it. Okay, so simultaneously with that, the Applied Jurisprudence Institute of the Supreme People's Court of China, so this would be like the research arm of the Supreme Court in the United States if there was such a thing, in 2008 released a guide for judges on domestic violence related to marital cases. So remember, right, the marital law, the national marital law was amended in the early 2000s to specifically state that domestic violence is one of the permissible reasons for getting a divorce. So approximately 5 years later, the Supreme People's Court issues the equivalent of a bench book for judges, essentially, okay? And that is the first of its kind. Actually, bench books are not readily utilized. Guidances for judges are not kind of a commonplace thing in China. And it specifically stipulated the use of personal safety guarding measures, which I think is just fabulous language, including issuance of a personal safety guarding ruling, which is basically a civil protection order for a person who alleges domestic violence during divorce proceedings. Okay, so this was the first time that there was a particular articulation of what the marital law amendments meant, right, by legal remedies for victims in marital cases when they're asserting domestic violence as a basis for divorce. I'm getting all lawyerly here. Does that make sense? Okay. And the Supreme People's Court appointed 9 trial courts as part of the pilot project, which meant that judges in those 9 courts were given authority and discretion to issue these protection orders. And that expanded to 27, and now over 100 courts are a part of this pilot project. And the first civil protection order was issued in Hunan District People's Court in 2008. And by October of 2010, 100 orders have been issued nationwide. Now, what's the population of China? Just pause for a moment. Okay, so 100 protection orders have been issued in the entire country since this pilot project was launched. 98 of them, there's been reports of only 2 violations of 2 orders of those 100. So what got reported in China in the news in 2010 and last year was this great success of these protection orders because only 2 have been violated, reported as violated. Anyone who does this work see a problem with that assessment of success of protection orders? I see a lot of smiles in the room. Please, someone help me. We don't do it that way, right, in the US? We don't judge the effectiveness of a protection order by reported violations of it, right? Why not? They're not reported, yes, that's a very good point. So we have really no idea what's going on here or there, yes. Also, is that really how we know if they're working? I'm putting the word working in quotes, right? So there's a lot there that I'm looking forward to unpacking, but it got a lot of press nationally, okay? So then in 2009, this research arm of the Supreme People's Court also launched national trainings in collaboration with the American Bar Association and the Anti-Domestic Violence Network, national trainings of police on how to collect evidence for consideration in these pilot protection order cases particularly, but all over the country. Notice, however, where they started, Hunan. Right? So if you remember at the very beginning, that province was one of the very first provinces to issue a policy on domestic violence. Can't wait to get to Hunan, I'm serious. Can't wait, I have not yet been to Hunan. Okay? And then in 2011, a research project was launched with the support of the UN Women, which is the UN's now global body that has encompassed all issues on women, including violence against women, the police, essentially, the China Women's Federation, and the Police Academy, which is, you know, the police, the security people in Hunan, okay? And so they actually started to do research on how the police were responding, right? They actually started to do data collection on calls to the police from victims of domestic violence, right? Whether the police are showing up, what they're finding when they get there, what they're doing. That study has not yet been completed. And then this year, just about 3 weeks ago, I received a copy of a 181-page handbook for the police on how to handle domestic violence cases in China. And it is amazing. It incorporates threat assessment, incorporates a lot of the stuff that we've done in the US based on these trainings, in large part, that were done in '09 by an American police officer. And it's an amazing document. Of the 181 pages, 5 are in English. The table of contents is included. I'm working on having someone help me with that. I'll get back to you. But it includes an extensive appendix of forms, actually. Which is what I'm really, it's funny because they're like, Miss Robin, would you like us to translate chapter 4? And I'm like, no, I want the appendices. And they're like, you're so strange. And I'm like, I know. But I'm really curious about those documents. And then in addition to doing training of police, the Supreme People's Court and the ABA began hosting national trainings of judges, specifically in the provinces that are doing that pilot protection order project in 2010. And next year, they're going to start doing training of judges in criminal cases, which is going to be very interesting. And then also the ABA with Zhongji Women's Legal Counseling and Services Center, which is the only women's rights legal center in the country, started training lawyers in those jurisdictions that have the pilot protection order projects in 2010. And they've done a series of those. So future efforts, they really are, on a national level at least, very focused on getting this anti-domestic violence law passed. This is a really huge undertaking. Getting the next draft done is definitely their focus. I met with the executive director of the Anti-Domestic Violence Network last week, and she has asked me to help them because they're going to add an entire section on the impact of domestic violence on the workplace and on the employment circumstances of battered women. So they've asked me to help them draft that and do some education work over the next few months. So that's kind of exciting. In addition to that, one of their focuses in the draft anti-domestic violence law and going back looking at the marital law, right, in those policy papers on a local level, is expanding the definition of domestic violence to include sexual violence, same-sex intimate violence, and defining psychological violence. So again, the advocates, my friends in the room, does this sound vaguely familiar? This is exactly the process that we've been going through. If you look, I just wrote a paper where if you look at the Violence Against Women Act that was passed in 1994, and you look at the Violence Against Women Act that's pending currently, we went from defining domestic violence as violence against women as domestic violence and sexual violence to what's pending currently in Congress, well, okay, in the Senate, not the House version, is domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, sex trafficking, child abuse, elder abuse, child maltreatment, same-sex gender, youth, teen dating violence. That's the evolution we've seen between 94 and 2011 in this country. They're doing it in like 4 years. That's great. Okay. And then they're also really focused on accountability around CEDAW, because that is something that the Chinese government signed on to in 1980, and so they are very focused on utilizing that as a tool. Okay, and I've actually included the definition of violence against women that is in CDOT in the slide, because that's the guide that the advocates are using when they're talking with the leadership in Beijing currently. There's this also very interesting conversation that I have just started to understand and hope to do more work around, which is a discussion of whether domestic violence should be defined by its consequences, and concerns being raised that focusing on harm would inhibit context. And this is a dialogue that we've had over the last 25 years here, so I'm very interested in this. In the beginning, we were so focused on defining domestic violence by what it did to victims, that we actually did a poor job of focusing on who was committing the crime. And we also removed, many people believed, our ability to look at the context in which the behavior was occurring, and that inhibited effectual change and addressing domestic violence. They're also very focused on evidence collection, and I'm helping them do some additional trainings on evidence collection and consideration of marital cases. They're doing a lot more police training. And they're focusing next year on training for judges and lawyers in criminal prosecution of batterers, and a huge part of that is going to be on the integration of expert witnesses. And again, that's bringing in evidence of the impact of domestic violence on victims.
I have a question, and I see in your future efforts you kind of address a little bit of this for criminal prosecution of batterers, but you mentioned the Marriage Act and you mentioned some of the policy papers. Are there specific legislative acts or policy acts, or however, whatever the terminology
those
might
things
be,
are, yeah,
that would be the equivalent of what we would look at as a crime, a defined crime? Does that exist there now, or do they look at something like divorce as being so serious, really, that it is a punitive measure?
Yeah. That's a great question. So far what I've been able to uncover is that there is no national law that defines domestic violence as a crime. However, some people have argued that there's this term abuse, and that this term abuse, it's really used in the child abuse context, could be interpreted to include domestic violence, but the penalties are minimal. So the domestic violence community is very engaged in, as a part of this anti-domestic violence law, to include a definition of the crime of domestic violence on a national level. Now, what I have started to ask folks, and I'm really, I'm going to start traveling to provinces starting in January, is to ask affirmatively whether or not they have resolutions or policy papers specifically defining domestic violence or sexual abuse as a crime, because none of the information that I have collected has that, and nobody that I've talked to thus far in Beijing knows the answer to that. I think an interesting companion question is kind of where sexual assault is, right? Which is a blind spot that we had in this country for a very long time. As someone who's worked in this work for a very long time, I confess that I came up as a domestic violence victim advocate and then learned more about sexual violence about 10 years into my work. And I'm concerned maybe that may be evolving in a similar way. Though I have to say the National Anti-Domestic Violence Law includes sexual violence as a form of domestic violence, and the judicial guidebook that the Supreme People's Court issued also includes specifically sexual assault and sexual violence as a form of domestic violence. So there is that explicit inclusion, which I didn't see in our early drafts of things.
Reported violations.
Yes.
Are the violations for protection orders in China, are they treated criminally, or do they have a tendency to be treated civilly in those two cases?
So fascinating question that I actually have tried to get an answer to. So remember, this is a pilot project, there's no law. So this is the equivalent of the Supreme Court saying we're going to allow New Jersey, Alabama, and California, right, these judges in those trial courts to, on their own discretion in marital cases only, to issue protection orders when they deem it's appropriate. So the two cases, both were reported in the press. Neither one focused on the civil-criminal dichotomy, right? But both of them, from the description in the media that I don't have a copy of the orders, and I don't think I will ever get them, but I'm going to try. I'm learning those words in Chinese right now. Is the description in the paper makes them sound like stay-away orders. And so the violation doesn't necessarily, I would not think, result in, so they don't arrest, they detain. And I need to explain that the role of the police in society in China is much more fraught than it is here. There was actually a really interesting report on NPR about 10 days ago about the black prisons. So people get detained and they disappear. So the threat of criminal anything in China has this heightened level of concern with it. And the other thing I want to say that is very clear in all of the work being done by the anti-domestic violence community is they also singularly identify that the women that they are serving consistently state that they don't want their perpetrators put in jail. Anyone hear that before? They don't want them detained, they don't want them to go away, and this has, again, such a heightened, we can imagine, our clients for years have told us the same thing, right? They just want the behavior to stop, they don't want him to be put in jail. In China, that is very, very parallel. So the struggle is to try to manage that, and the trainings that I've been a part of with judges and lawyers have been about how to maneuver that. If you're not going to detain them, what are the other options to create accountability, which is the other big problem.
In China, then, I guess in North Dakota too, before we had, well, actually, we don't really have a law in North Dakota that says assault between a man and a woman. It's not called domestic violence. Right. We have a law, if it's a minor assault, called simple assault, which has a subsection recognizing implications for domestic violence, but it's not domestic violence, simple assault. In China, is their law, their minor law on assault, is an assault between a man and a woman not recognized under that?
So I haven't gotten it translated, I'm trying to get my hands on a translation of the criminal code in China, and I've gotten parts, but I believe I haven't gotten that part yet. But what I've been told, so this is a hearsay moment, is that there is a national level law that identifies assault between individuals as criminal behavior, but that it doesn't have locality or relationship of the people, again, because it's just assault. So it doesn't matter if it happens on a street corner by a stranger or in your backyard or right at school or at work. And that is often referred to as inclusive of domestic violence.
So does that prohibit, I mean, women can still report a crime of violence between them and their spouse, and it doesn't have to be recognized as domestic violence per se.
That's correct, and that's very similar, as you're pointing out, to the situation that existed in the United States before the 1970s. The concern here is parallel there, right? Which is the concern that my understanding as someone who's followed this in this country is that although simple assault and battery were on the books in this country forever and didn't specify, right, the relationship between the person who committed the assault and the victim, there was the actual enforcement meant that you were left with that particular police who showed up in that moment and then that prosecutorial office and then that judge deciding, right? And what we saw systemically in this country is people said, oh, well, that happened in the home. It clearly isn't. Right? So not enforcing it. So the decision was made in many states, but not all, as you point out, right, to separately pass a criminal code or amend, right, the assault and battery sections to clarify that it included domestic violence. And that was done as an education component, right, but also to really kind of shut down any discretion at an enforcement level. And that is the concern that's being raised in China currently. I don't know where that's going to take them, but...
I have two questions for you, and they're I would describe them as culturally related. Coming from a business law perspective, and concepts of doing business in China, there are local authorities in the municipalities and provinces, and there's also this concept, and I hesitate to use this word because it's a terrible translation, but it's almost like a gang. That there are bonding between individuals who monitor, take bribes, etc. Does this weigh in to prevention, enforcement of domestic violence issues? Other issue. Other question? Do you want me to ask me?
No, let me do that because I can't hold a lot in my brain at the moment.
Sure thing.
So corruption, which is what I would consider an umbrella for the description you just given me. Corruption is alive and well in China, and its manifestations include what you describe, and it currently is getting an enormous amount of international and domestic attention because of this changeover in the leadership. I love that I can't say election. The handover that's currently happening between white men in downtown Beijing there's one woman. They did let one woman in, but we don't know if she's going to get a position. Most of those people have been accused publicly, either in the New York Times or by Bloomberg or by China Daily, of being corrupt. So, I mean, it's all the way up the food chain. And the accusations, particularly about those individuals, and those are the people who are writing the laws in the country, okay, this is significant, right, and who are making decisions about what companies and industries are permitted to do business in China and how, and they're using that to amass fortunes that they're then moving over to Switzerland. And these are touchy questions. So as a foreigner, when I'm meeting with peers, and I mean peers, professors and scholars and activists on these issues, I have been well sensitized to be very careful about how I ask questions about that. And as close as I got to that was my questioning about, do you think that anti-domestic violence legislation is going to move this year? And the look, and you know when you stepped in the doo-doo, because like the look in this poor woman's face, like I have just touched the third rail, right? And she was very polite and just said they are good people, and I'm sure good people will be making those decisions, and I trust that they will make the right decisions, but you know, there are influences. And this is not a money-making enterprise. Now, I'm just going to pause and make an editorial comment here, which is some of what I hear described about that in China and the impact it has on legislative changes and policy changes is not completely different from what we see in the US. I'm not saying, please don't misinterpret me, please, this is being taped. I am not saying our leadership is corrupt, and I don't believe that. What I mean by that is having worked on federal legislation for many years now, and we currently have had VAWA pending for over a year for reauthorization. And part of the reason we can't get it passed is because there is no money interest, right? Because we have people giving money to our elected officials as well. And so their needs get prioritized when you've got a limited amount of time to get things passed, right? I mean, this is a reality. And so you have to pull from a different place. So what she did say is that there are people that they believe are sympathetic to their issues. The question is whether or not they can overcome this larger agenda that these very good people who are very wise and always make good decisions are setting currently in Beijing. Does that make sense? So those are questions I'm very interested in. I don't know that I will ever get to a place where I can ask them. I certainly don't think I will in Beijing. I need to leave Beijing to have conversations like that.
Be careful.
Yeah.
The other concept I was thinking about is, as you were describing how in the move in China towards creating awareness and enforcement and prevention of domestic violence, they have been ahead of what would be the U.S. timeline with regards to prevention. Yeah. Yes. Wondering if that is a historical and may have some historical and cultural aspects, given that they have a huge background in communism and dictating how things are done.
Yeah. No, I think those are great questions that are actually on my research question list, is kind of why the emphasis on prevention has come about so quickly. Now, when I ask that question so far in my interviews, the answer I get is because they have benefited from external funding from Ford and from other global, you know, from US, from the UN and elsewhere, to bring in experts from other parts of Asia, from the US, from Western countries, right, to have us share with them how we've done, and I've been a part of that, right? And so what they like to say is what they've done is they've tried to learn from, you know, the successes and the challenges that other countries have faced in developing their legal system response ahead of us, and then adopt it to the unique circumstances of China. That's the answer I get to my question about prevention. I will say that those conversations are one of the places where I need to go back with an interpreter, because I'm talking to someone who I speak in English, she speaks in English, but is a native Chinese speaker, and I really feel we're losing something in translation. So I have to find money to pay someone to come with me the next time I talk with them.
Well, at this point, I just want to say thank you, Professor Runge, for sharing your research and everything that's going on in China. We'll lead into our next speaker, but thank you very much for coming today.